Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2026 annual Cheung Lecture in Animal Science. My name is Cheung Lecture. I'm a professor in the Department of Animal Science. It's my pleasure to serve as chair for today's seminar. This annual lecture recognizes and honors Dr. Stan Chen, enduring support for Department of Animal Science and Agricultural Research at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Chen obtained his BSc, MSc, and a PhD in animal science from the University of Manitoba. His graduate training was in animal breeding and genetics under the supervision of the late Dr. Bob Parker. He was also awarded a Doctor of Law from the University of Manitoba in 1991. Dr. Chen returned to his family business in Hong Kong in 1975, served as executive chairman and director of Harvard Holding Ltd. Dr. Chen's many contributions include support of T.K. Chin Center for Animal Science Research, the National Center for Livestock and the Environment, and also T.K. Chin Reading Room, and the recent contribution to education and research in animal science. In recognition of his generosity and commitment to education and research, the department established the annual seminar in his honor. Today, we are delighted to have Dr. Dan Very from University of British Columbia, join us to deliver this year's lecture. And also, I want to thank for our graduate student to nominate Dr. Very. Thanks to our graduate student. And before we begin, we would like to introduce Dr. Very briefly. Dr. Very is a professor at the University of British Columbia, and Dr. Very did his BSc and MSc at the McGill University and a doctoral degree at the Oxford University before co-founding UBC Animal Welfare Program, where he now co-directs his active research group. His research focuses on understanding the perspectives of animals and applies this insight to develop methods of assessing animal welfare and improving lives of animals. His work has helped driving change in the practice, including the adoption of higher milk rations for the calf and the pain management of disbudding. And the health method including adoption social housing for pre-weaned calf. He also studied cow comfort and lameness, social interaction among cows, interaction between cows and human handlers, and technology like an automated milk system. They are increased use on farm. Okay, the title of his presentation today is Using Science to Assess and Improve the Welfare of Dairy Cattle. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Very.
Thank you very much, Engel, for the introduction. And what a pleasure to be here. It's been far too long. I think the last time I was on this campus was almost 20 years ago. It was welcomed very nicely here. I had a chance to meet with some colleagues last night. I really appreciated that. And especially grateful to be nominated by the graduate students. So thank you very much, students, for the opportunity to come here. I hope that, I look forward to meeting you hopefully later today and hearing some of your questions about your projects as well. And I hope you find, something of interest in what I'm about to say. Which is a little bit in a way, a bit of a retrospective. I've sort of combined some stories from throughout my career, which tell a story about how I've tried to use science to try to understand and improve the lives of dairy cattle, and in that way also the people who care for the animals. I wanted to start off just by telling you a little bit more who I am, and part of understanding that is understanding how our research is funded. So right from the time that I arrived at UBC almost 30 years ago now, I've been supported by the dairy industry, including organizations like Dairy Farmers of Canada right from the very beginning. I want to particularly point out the Dairy Farmers of Manitoba on this slide that currently is supporting our research. It is a tremendous item of both pride and sort of responsibility to be doing work in service of dairy producers. It doesn't mean that my messages are always nicely received, but it does mean that there's a relationship of respect and long-term commitment to working together. And I must say that's one of the things that I value greatly about working in agricultural sciences. So. Yeah, very proud to be affiliated with everyone on this slide. I wanted to show you a picture of our farm. So here we are this is Agassiz, the big town of Agassiz, British Columbia. This is Mount Chiam in the background, and that's our farm right in the foreground. So it's beautifully situated beside the mountains. Almost a stone's throw from the Fraser River, yeah, surrounded by very high quality land, which of course is the engine that drives our cows. My talk today is partly built on this framework. So this is a framework, one of the theoretical conceptual frameworks we use to try to understand animal welfare, which in this case we call the three-sphere framework, and it helps identify the types of concerns that people have when we talk about the care of animals. One, which is sort of in a way the most intuitive for an animal science audience, is just looking at aspects of basic health and functioning. Obviously, the animals need to be healthy from a farming perspective. Ideally, the animals are also productive. We also often critics of animal agriculture, for example, might point out issues where the animals are cared for in ways that are perceived not to allow the animals to perform natural behaviors, for example. And so sometimes an understanding of what is natural and how important those behaviors or those access to natural environments might be for the animal can help inform changes that we can use to improve practices. And then finally, we have affective states, which is sort of a fancy word for saying the emotions of animals. And I'm going to talk today, for example, about some pretty basic ones, including pain, but obviously keeping animals in ways that prevent them from experiencing unpleasant affective states like pain, and ideally allowing them to experience positive things in their life is going to be an important component of creating environments that work well for animals. So I'm going to talk about all three of those. I'm going to sort of try to build a story around those a bit too, because some of them, the two spheres in the bottom, I think are a little bit easier to understand scientifically, and a lot of in my opinion, I think the most exciting scientific work comes in the top sphere, which is, well, how do we really make scientific inferences about what's going in the hearts and the heads of an animal? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that at the end. So that's the journey we'll hope to go on today. Okay, start off both with a simple example, but also sort of, this is sort of at the beginning of my career. This is coming into our farm, still in that same location, but a very different calf barn. These were our calves in our old indoor calf pens. And I'd come from my background as a researcher. I was actually, I did my PhD as a wildlife researcher, actually working on wild birds. And then I transferred, I met my current colleague still, David Fraser, who was working on pigs. And he said, oh, you have to come and work on these pigs, because he thought that some of the ideas I had, believe it or not, on the birds would apply to the pigs. And so I followed David to Ottawa at the time and became a pig behavior and welfare researcher, and did a lot on care of neonatal pigs. And I was sort of shocked to come to the dairy and find that we were feeding these dairy calves this limited amount of milk, and that the calves, to my impression, weren't growing like piglets did. And so it sort of struck me as odd as wearing my pig hat. And so I started just to look at the way we were feeding calves with a fresh eye. And one of the things that I saw we were doing is we're feeding the calves just twice a day. I mean, that made sense. We milk the cows twice a day, so no one wanted to bring milk buckets back and forth more often. People, what we were doing at the time is we'd give the calves a bucket full of milk. It's about 2 liters. So the animals would get 4 liters a day. And the animals would drink that bucket like that. Anyone's seen calf drink a bucket of milk? It just like inhales it. It's really impressive, actually. And so anyways, it all looked sort of weird to me as a pig guy. And so then this is sort of with the idea of how do we use this sort of natural behavior, natural living concept to inform ideas in terms of care. So I went back and I spent some time sort of watching what calves do when they're in the cow. Of course, we didn't have a lot of calves on the cow on the dairy side, but we have lots on the beef side, so hence the beef photo here. And you see a bunch of different things, right? If those people that spend time with beef calves know this to be the case. The calves drink many more times than 2, especially when they're young. Each milk meal will last several minutes. It doesn't just happen in a snap of the fingers. And over the day, the calf's able to drink much more milk. And so then, well, how do you apply some of those lessons to the calf? Of course, we could bring the cow into the barn. We can talk about that later if you're interested, but I won't talk about that today otherwise. So what we did is we created something that looks nothing like a cow. This is what I call the $1.38 UBC solution. This is just basically a teat hooked up to a central reservoir. And so, well, what does a calf do with this? It doesn't look like the cow. What does it do with it? Well, it goes to the teat many times a day, 6 to 10 times a day, like it does with the cow. Each milk meal lasts several minutes, and over the course of the day, it drinks at least 10 liters of milk. So it shows that we can get ideas from understanding more natural systems and integrate those into our existing systems in practical ways that provide real benefits for the calves. Anybody who it needs convincing just needs to compare their calves after 3 or 4 weeks being fed like this versus our standard ways, and you can just walk down. This is one of the first studies I did at our barn to convince my own farm manager we need to change practice. Is you just walked through and you looked at the calves, and our farm manager never went back. Okay, so take homes on this bit. Well, we can learn from natural behavior. Solutions don't need to look natural. Our teat looks nothing like a cow, right? But they need to allow the animals to perform important behaviors. For feeding calves, this means feeding lots of milk, feeding milk with a teat where the aperture is small enough that the meal lasts a substantial amount of time. And it turns out these messages are going to be very important when I come to the next part of my talk. So these things fit together like management often does, right? Getting one part is going to be an essential ingredient for a second part. And that second part is on social housing. So the other thing that, of course, struck me as odd coming from the pig world is we have all these calves in these individual pens. And this is odd not just from the perspective of how we rear pigs. This is odd from the way we care for any other mammalian animal that I'm aware of. In fact, when Harry Harlow did his work in the 1950s on social separation, trying to understand the effects for example, of children that had been affected by the war and growing up in sometimes very poor conditions in orphanages. He did his animal models on macaques, which were even extremely contentious at the time, of keeping these young macaques socially isolated. And kind of study which I don't think that would be approved in any Canadian institution now. But the irony is you come into the dairy system, and of course this is just normal for us, right? This is what we do, and we do it for what we think are very good reasons, because people are very concerned, indeed, as my farm manager was very concerned about the high levels of especially enteric, but also respiratory disease in calves, and the idea that the way we need to keep our calves alive is by keeping them individually, right? This was dogma at the time. But I, knowing this stuff and coming as again from this different world, I was wanted to understand, well, what are some of the downsides for the calf of being reared in an environment where they are socially isolated? And we know from this really vast literature in the mammalian, on the mammalian side and other species, of what some of the negative effects are. Animals are much more, have difficulties form in social relationships, difficulties in reproductive behavior, prolonged non-nutritive sucking, which we'll come back to later, as well as a bunch of cognitive deficits, very interestingly. And one of the most profound is this very high sensitivity to anything change, to novelty. So animals, we often think of our farm animals as being neophobic, but animals which have been socially reared are particularly neophobic. And they also have very characteristic learning difficulty. So animals that are reared in social isolation are able to learn, but they're not able to adapt to change. So they're not able to relearn. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Because I just we did a bunch of work on understanding social rearing, including the practical aspects of trying to get social housing systems to work. But this, I'll give you a more sort of scientific study here. And so here is a test, a simple learning test, and I'll show you in a second what it looks like. We basically have calves with a video screen, and it's a very boring video game. It's the screen is either red or white, and you can set it up. So for example, in this case, they approach a screen. Actually, I've got it labeled here differently. The video I'm about to show you, they approach the red screen for a reward, and the white screen, they don't get a reward. Then, once the animals have learned this, then you can do this reversal task. So they've got this, I know what to do, I know which screen to approach, and the next day they come in and the rules have changed, okay? Anybody who's worked with, well, for example, dairy cattle that are used to entering the parlor from the left side, and then all of a sudden you try to bring them on the right side, you know what I mean, right? This can be, dealing with change can be an issue, and this is basically what we're doing, is we're asking how quickly the calves can make that connection. So here's our video of our calf. It presses the button to get the screen to change color, hits the red screen, and it goes to the corner, and it's drinking its little milk rewards, or it's giving it milk as a treat. Just gets a few hundred grams, pesters about it, gets a white screen, doesn't like it. No. Touches again, red. Goes to the screen, gets it, gets this milk reward. So a calf learns this very quickly, quicker than a golden retriever. And so the calves learned it, and okay, well then what happens? Okay, so this is a classic a learning curve. Now I'm showing you the reversal phase. So the animals had all of the animals are able to get that red, white, no problem, and now we switch the color. These are calves that are socially housed, and the first thing I want you to notice is in the first few days you test them, of course the animals are going to the wrong side. They're getting 0% correct. This is way less than chance. But from their perspective, they're getting 100% correct, right? Because they're still going to the red screen. And then after a while, well, they start taking chances, and sooner or later, all the calves in our group learn that the rules of the game have changed. And the individually housed calves, only about 20% of them ever get it. So now I can show you data from other kinds of deficits associated with this, but this is just one example. I wanted to just tell you also a little bit about, on the practical side, is that social housing can look like lots of different things. These are our group pens that we have at UBC now. This is now our new barn, not the old one I was showing you earlier. And here we keep a group of about 8 or 10 calves. I'll show you this picture from the other angle in a minute, but we have automated milk feeders and grain feeders and roughage and water intake in the front. But group pens don't need to look like this. Here's our farm manager likes to keep our calves individually for the first couple days after birth still. And what you can see is this is one of our individual pens, and there's these barriers between the pens that can easily be removed, so then you have a double pen. It's basically just a standard pen. You just removed a wall, and it's 2 calves sharing it. So this is sort of like the prototype group housing. Very, very simple. Turns out that calves housed in this way show almost all the same advantages as calves housed in a larger group, and it's a little bit easier for farmers to manage. So there's not a one-size-fits-all. It really depends on the farmer in terms of what they're looking for, but there's a number of practical options available for doing group housing. Take-home messages here is individual rearing is a welfare issue. We talked a little bit about, for example, they're more fearful and show learning deficits. And also that there are many options out there for switching to social housing. But that doesn't mean that that transition is going to be an easy one. Indeed, some ways the sort of narrative that I'm going to take you on today goes from dealing with, I think, some of the changes which are relatively easy to adopt, like feeding more milk, through to ones which are more difficult to adopt. And so for those of you that are up on the calves will realize that in our most recent update for the Code of Practice for Dairy, there will be a requirement for farmers to start social housing as of 2031. So, and right now, it's about 1/3 of dairy farms in Canada are using this. So many farms are social housing, but there's still a chunk that aren't. And how are those farms going to make that transition? And it requires actually putting a bunch of management things together. So it's not, those farms are going to need continued support, including continued research support. And one of the areas in which that we know that that farms are concerned about is this issue, which is that when calves are in individual pens, they are obviously unable to suck on each other, but calves, when you put 2 of them together, are now able to suck on one another. And cross-sucking is a concern to dairy farms for a number of issues. We've been doing research, and that's what this reference is also in terms of trying to better understand farmers' concerns and also what they see as their needs for further research too, because essentially our biological research, the way we see it, goes hand in hand with a sort of more social science research in terms of understanding the concerns of dairy farms, especially around changes in practices. Okay, the nice thing about this particular issue is that we know a lot about what drives non-nutritive oral behaviors. That's sort of, again, the fancy scientific way for describing behaviors like cross-sucking. And I gave you a hint already. Those rhesus macaques that were socially isolated showed a high degree of this abnormal sucking behavior. And we can essentially eliminate those kinds of behaviors if we do what? We provide calves lots of milk, we feed calves via teat, we make sure the aperture on the teat is small so the milk meals last several minutes, and the animal is therefore able to not only get, thinking about it from a satiety perspective, not only getting a belly full of milk, but very importantly is able to also engage in that natural behavior for all of us mammals of getting the milk via a teat. So walk through some of that. So infant mammals, all of us, are highly motivated to suck as babies. That's what keeps us alive, right? Satiety requires not just milk, but it requires a prolonged bout of the suckling. And very interestingly, just the taste of milk, if you give just a few drops of milk, will initiate a strong sucking motivation. And so you come back here to my old calf barn picture, and me feeding that calf that beautiful bucket of milk that it drank in about 15 seconds. What does the calf spend the next 10 minutes doing? I mean, anybody who's been a calf barn says it spends the rest 10 minutes sucking on anything it can find. Now, that individual calf couldn't suck on another calf because there was no calf in the pen, but it sucked upon the bucket, it sucked upon the side of the wall. If you look, you see all the marks on where the paint's come off, right? And so this is just, and we've always considered sort of normal. It's like, oh, you go into the calf pen, isn't that cute? The calf comes up and sucks on you, right? But it's like, no, this is like a highly abnormal behavior that the calf is basically telling us, I'm looking for a normal, natural outlet for my highly motivated sucking behavior. I want to show this slide too to show how the technology can be very much our friend in terms of applying some of these things, but it can also, we can misapply technologies, and we often do. So here is, I promised you I'd show you the front end of our calf barn. So those are our Instant feeders we use to feed and measure forage, and over here are our milk feeders, which are also grain feeders. And the milk and grain feeder combo is a beautiful way of gradually weaning calves. That turns out to be really important because how you wean calves is also another very important determinant of these bouts of non-nutritive sucking. So the features I talked about earlier are really to prevent non-nutritive sucking early in life, but another time we get non-nutritive sucking is at weaning, and we can greatly reduce that risk by managing weaning well, and that particular piece of equipment helps. But we can also mismanage that piece of equipment, and I'm going to show you an example of how. So here is a classic picture of technology going wrong in this case. So there's a calf drinking its milk meal, and what's the calf behind it doing? And again, how do we get in the head of that calf and understand, well, why is it doing that? Well, I want to show you some interesting and counterintuitive results. So just take a minute to admire this slide. So this is the amount of time, minutes per day, a calf spends in the milk feeder. This is a calf fed as much milk as it wants. On average, it's drinking about 10 or 12 liters of milk. Here's a calf just getting 4 liters a day. But the calf getting a third amount of milk is taking twice as much time in the feeder. Like, what's going on, right? Also think a little bit about the math. As I said, when in our calf pens, we have about 8 to 10 calves in a group. However, people selling calf feeders often want to dilute the cost of the feeder across a number of calves. So sometimes people tell you to manage them with 20 calves in the feeder. Imagine if you had 20 calves sharing a feeder and you're feeding them like this. There simply isn't enough time for the calves to spend the amount of time they want in the feeder. And so you have calves, you have crowding, and you've got this combined problem too of calves just getting a little bit of milk, calves left highly motivated to suck on something, but calves not having a natural outlet for it. Let me show you when you break down these slides by the number of feeding events. There's sort of 2 things you can imagine what a calf might do when it goes in the feeder. One is it goes in and it drinks a normal milk meal. Another is it just goes in the feeder and it doesn't get any milk. When you're programmed the feeder to deliver a limited amount of milk, obviously many of the time the calf goes in the feeder is not eligible for a milk meal. And so these are these unrewarded visits. And so what you see is the calf feeder gets filled by the calf just going to check to see whether the feeder is available for a milk meal, which it normally isn't. And then you get a lineup of calves behind the occupied feeder. Okay. Take-home messages on the cross-sucking is we know a lot about this behavior. Calves are highly motivated to suck, and without a suitable outlet, they will redirect this behavior. How do we do it? How do we avoid it? We feed the calves lots of milk with a small aperture teat, and we avoid competition for teats, and we avoid abrupt weaning. So some really practical tricks and tips we can give to producers as they move towards group housing. And as I said, I think there's a really urgent job for for those of us in the dairy industry to help producers, to help support producers as they make that transition. Okay, I'm going to switch to a cow example. This is on pasture access. Again, it sort of came to me as a newcomer to dairy when this is 30 years ago now. I showed you the picture of our farm, right? So we have this beautiful barn, but we're surrounded by all this beautiful grass. We use a lot of grass for forage feeding, for silage in BC because it's a great place to produce grass. And that pasture is just outside. So this is just 2 meters away from the door of our barn is this pasture. And so started to do work in terms of looking at, it's like, okay, well, what happens when you give cows access to pasture? Of course, it's not like pasture is a new thing for dairy cattle. People have been using intensive pasturing for as long as people have been milking cows. But we have a very different context, and I think it's a real sort of made in Canada advantage. We have beautiful barns. People have put a lot of effort into designing and managing very good indoor facilities. And the question is with access to those excellent indoor facilities, how important is it for the cows to also be able to occasionally go outdoors? So here's just one of the early studies we did where we just simply opened the door to the barn. And there's a bunch of things that surprised me about this result. One thing is I expected that, of course, the cows are going to go outside on those nice summer days when the sun's out. In fact, the cows tend to avoid going outside during the day. So this is time of day on the x-axis, percentage of cows on pasture. Here's the time of day when I thought the cows would be outside, and most cows don't go outside then. Also, this is very important for those that develop diets for our intensively housed cows. When do all of the cows choose to come in the barn? They come in when we provide our fresh TMR. So the cows are highly motivated to come in and consume the prepared diets we have, despite having all that beautiful pasture outside. But despite having this beautiful barn that we're very proud of, almost all of the cows have voted with their feet to go outside in the night. Some of the cows are coming in here. What's happening here? So when we're pushing up the TMR. So the cow's still motivated to come into the barn for some reasons. So there's a lot of things going on there. But it's complex. But the take home from this is that the cows do want to go outside, at least sometimes. Okay, one of the things we're interested in also is, well, okay, maybe I prefer red M&Ms than the chocolate M&Ms, but how much do I prefer them? So one way we can ask animals how much they prefer them is making them to pay a cost. So in this case, we have a gate, and it's set up here to not only frustrate the cows, but also to frustrate our farm staff, because we've trained the calves to push on the gate. What we do here is we just simply add more and more weight to the gate every day, so it's harder and harder for the cows to get outside. So here's a cow. She's trying to push, I think it's 54 kilos of weight, so it's a lot. You can see it stress that the bar as she gets outside, but she finally makes her way out. Here's another cow that's either a little stronger, a little bit more adept at the game, and she's able to push that weight a little bit more clearly. So you can basically ask the cows, how much are you willing, sure you'd like to go outside, but how much are you willing to pay to go outside? And like every good experiment, you need a control. So here is this exactly the same setup, but in this case, the cows are simply getting access to their fresh TMR in the morning. And as you would expect, there are 22 cows in this group, and all of the cows push the lowest weight to get access to the fresh TMR. But as we increase the amount of weight every day, fewer and fewer cows are willing to pay the price to go get the fresh TMR. And so when you get right up to here, then no cows are able or willing to pay the prices. Fresh TMR is nice, but it's not that nice. What about pasture? The two lines intersect almost exactly. So cows, basically the take-home message here is that the motivation to access pasture is about the same as the motivation to access fresh feed. So it gives us a comparator. Okay. As I pointed out to you in our earlier slide, I said we'd look at aspects of natural behaviors, natural living, but we'd also look at aspects of biological functioning. I think this is really important, partly because, as I showed in the initial slide, I have a responsibility to the farmers I work with, not only to create better solutions for their cows, but also to create solutions that are going to be better for their farm in the long run. One of the biggest and longest lasting challenges we have in dairying is a high rate of lameness. And it has been one which has been very hard to budge a needle on very much, despite lots of really good research. One of the things that I knew, actually, even from earlier research, this is a more recent study, but even from some of the very first studies that we did, is that when we put cows outside, they tended to recover from lameness. And this is an old trick. I didn't make this up. I had my local neighbor farmers tell me this, and many of whom that were occasionally would take a lame cow and they wanted to recover, they keep her outside for a period of time. But I was interested in our sort of free choice system. So again, I'm very interested. Many of our farmers, as I imagine the farmers are here, are very proud and have invested a lot of money in their beautiful indoor facilities. But what happens if you give cows access to the outdoors just part of the time? Does that still have these positive effects on cow lameness? So in this case, we took a bunch of cows that were enrolled as lame. For those that have done lameness scoring, there's typically we use some people use a 4 or 5 point scale. And in our scale, if you have a gait score of 3 or more, you're lame. All these cows had a gait score of at least 3. And they had access to one of these automatic selection gates. And that means you could randomize cows in the group. So we had 54 animals in this group. Half the animals were randomized. The selection gate would bung them out onto the pasture. Half of the cows, they just came through a return and they came back into the barn. Okay? So all cows, same group, managed in the same way, just some had access to pasture. And I showed you already, the cows are using pasture in a variable amount of time, mostly, in the evenings. And the question is, well, what happens to the lameness? And so this is the total number of weeks the cows are spending sound. It's important to realize that lameness is, and anybody who's worked on this is one of the frustrating aspects of that ailment, is that it's not like you cure it and it goes away. It comes and goes. And what you find is that those cows that have continuous access to that indoor system, they're still coming in lame. This is over 6-week study where they had access to outdoors, and the number of weeks that those cows spend sound is very small. But if you give the cows access to pasture, we see that they spend about twice as much time sound. So despite a relatively modest intervention of just letting the cows go outside when they want, we see a relatively substantive improvement in the cow's gait. As I talked about with the calves, there's more than one. I think this is a really important way of thinking about welfare-friendly systems, is that we need to provide sort of a menu of options for different farmers. Each farm is different. Every farmer's in a different situation, and what kind of things are going to work for them. And I think we tend to have a bit of a tunnel, or maybe this is my bias, I should say anyways. When I started thinking about pasture, I thought about using intensive pasture where the cows are outside all the time. The cows quickly taught me that's not what they wanted. They wanted to come in and eat TMR, right? They wanted to come in, get out of the hot sun in the summer days. So I'm a big fan of these kinds of mixed systems, but what I've also learned over the time is that outdoor access doesn't need to look like a pasture. So this is work by one of our students, Anna Marika Schmidt. And all she did, especially in winter months, wasn't great for our land base having the cows outside. She simply put this, essentially a load of hog fuel right in front of our barn. And what she found is almost exactly the same results as I showed you earlier. The cows come outside. They come outside mostly at night. They vary in how much they come outside. And I must say they don't come outside quite as much for this as they do for pasture, but they come out a lot. Interestingly, they also come out in the middle of winter. And Not surprisingly, they don't come out as much on a day like this as when it's, especially in, as I said, summer nights is really their preferred time, but they come out and use it. And what I want you to look at when you look at this slide is, well, what are the cows doing when they're coming outside? They're not spending a lot of time, but what are they doing? They're doing behaviors. I don't know how many of you spend time inside our regular freestall barns. You don't see this behavior inside a freestall barn. And it turns out that some of those active behaviors are actually a really important part of our dairy industry. Because again, what's one of our the biggest ongoing challenges that we have in dairying? One is lameness. The other is that cows don't get pregnant. And one of the reasons cows don't get pregnant is we have a hard time identifying when they're in estrus. And these estrus behaviors are often these kinds of active behaviors that I showed you earlier. This is a bit of a complicated slide, so I'm going to walk you through it. So this is THI, temperature humidity index. For cows like us, it's not just how hot it is, it's how humid it is. It's that combination that's really important for the cows. This is the number of estrus events we see per hour. So now, look at this as a nice cool day, probably much like it is today at our barn in Agassiz, British Columbia. And whether or not the cows have access to the outdoors or they're indoors, they're expressing at similar numbers of estrus behaviors. But this slide shows something that we know from many studies in terms of the bottom graph, is that as it gets warmer, repro falls off. And one of the reasons repro falls off is because the number of estrus events rapidly declines. Providing the cows access to the outdoors removes that effect. So cows continue to be able to show their estrus behaviors when we provide an alternative area. So again, it's just sort of showing some of the practical benefits, health benefits can go hand in hand with the welfare benefits when we manage the system appropriately. So take-home messages here. Cows are at least sometimes motivated to go outside. And I think that's really important. One other thing I wanted to say about this is that I mentioned earlier how proud many of us are in dairy about the very good indoor environments we provide. But to me, one thing about opening the barn doors is that it allows us to truth test the quality of our indoor environments. We may think the environments are great, but if the cows are going outside, or indeed when they're coming inside, what are they looking for? And how can we do a better job, even, for example, in those days where maybe we don't want to provide any outdoor access at all? How do we make sure that we're providing what we can in the indoor facility that allows the animals to perform their most important behaviors and to achieve the things that they want to be able to achieve? As I said, when we get the outdoor access right, it can provide practical benefits to both the cows and the farmers. Okay, I said at the beginning I would leave the sort of scientifically most difficult, but I think also most fun in a way. Sorry to say that I shall have a picture of disbudding and talk about its fun, but scientifically most challenging aspect of how do we assess these sort of internal states in animals? How do I know what a cow is thinking and feeling? And most importantly here, because I'm going to use a lot of examples from disbudding, is you're not going to find a farmer, at least I never have, that thinks that calf is not experiencing pain in the moment. This is hot iron disbudding for those who aren't familiar with it. Very common. Our Holstein calves, almost all, are born with horns. Those horn buds are removed at an early developmental stage, and the most common way of doing that is cauterization, so it's a hot iron. It's a painful procedure. Nobody likes to do it. It's an unpleasant procedure for the calf and for the farmer. But it's necessary because nobody wants a freestall barn full of horned cattle, right? So very common procedure. What makes this procedure important to study is both that it's really common procedure, as I said, in dairy, so dairy needs solutions. But scientifically, it's a long-lasting pain. So anybody who's experienced a burn injury knows that that pain doesn't just happen in the moment, it happens for hours, maybe days after the procedure. So that gives a long period to study things. But it also, interestingly, is the case that most of our focus on pain mitigation and pain treatment has all been focused on that intraoperative pain. How do we make sure the animal is not experiencing right when you're putting the horn bite on? So for example, that can easily be done with a local block. Lidocaine solves that issue very quickly. But the pain that follows is actually much more difficult to treat. And one of the issues that we've been interested in is trying to get at this question, well, actually, how important is the calf? It stands to reason if we get a burn injury, it hurts, but is this a pain that we need to worry about? Is it a pain that we need to be treating, to be taking seriously as an industry? So I'm going to focus a little bit on the question is, how much does pain matter to animals, or in this case, our dairy calves? I'm going to start with actually a simpler example than disbudding. So this is a lovely experiment done by former PhD student Thomas Eddy, and he would build these beautiful experimental apparatuses to ask calves interesting questions. So here's a baby calf, a 2 or 3 week old calf, and he's trained the calf that it waits in this lobby area. Thomas, standing over there, has this gate on a string. He pulls the string, the gate opens, and the calf has learned that over here is a milk bottle. So calves are very motivated to drink their milk meal, and so the calf will move about as quickly as the calf can move and go and drink the milk. And it always happens, right? So that after a few experiences, the calf learns this, and in a second or two, it's gone to drink the milk bottle. So once the calves have learned this, then Thomas takes out of his back pocket one of 4 different treatments. So it randomizes calves to the most common, in a way, I think we think of them as innocuous procedure we can do to an animal. It's just an injection that we might use for a vaccine, for example. Most commonly in dairy, delivered intramuscularly, but we can also use other routes of delivery, including subcutaneous, intranasal, and we had a control group where they didn't get any injection at all. So the calves learned, okay, I'm always going to get my milk, but when I'm getting my milk, Thomas is going to take out one of the 4 treatments, right? Okay, so how do the calves respond? Well, initially the calves, and I said in the training phase, are fed with this 1 liter bottle of milk. But over time, Thomas also reduces the reward. So this is what we call it an approach avoidance. I showed you a little bit in terms of the calves pushing that weight. That's one way to get a motivation. But this is a sort of a more sophisticated way of getting a motivation. Because you can imagine there's a curve here of diminishing returns in terms of the reward, but there's also a cost they're having to pay to go get the reward. What do the calves do? This is when the calves are initially fed the 1 liter of milk, and you already see the treatments starting to separate. So these are box plots. So you see there's one calf here, way out here, taking 120 seconds to approach for the intramuscular injections. But for the most part, as I said, the calves are approaching very rapidly, about as quickly as a calf can run up. But as you reduce the milk reward, you see the treatments really begin to spread out. And so what do these results show you? Well, one is that if you have a choice, use a subcutaneous injection rather than intramuscular one, right? The calves are telling you essentially how much that they're willing to pay for these different types of injections, and they're finding the cost of the intramuscular much higher than the subcutaneous. So it gives us some practical advice, but it also shows you scientifically how do we use these sort of, in this case, these econometric approaches to try to understand the how important it is, how much it matters to a calf to have an injection. So really, I think practically important, it matters. It matters. But also practically, there are better ways we can do it. Okay, let's switch to disbudding. Obviously, disbudding, we could not use that other approach for, right? You're not going to get a calf to run up to Thomas for a hot iron And besides, you couldn't apply. I mean, for ethics and for our own for institutional ethics and for our own ethics, we're not going to reapply a hot iron day after day to train the animals, right? It's just unworkable, and it's inconceivable that the calf would choose to run up for a milk reward for hot iron. So how do we ask the question about hot iron? And in this case particularly, how do we ask the question about how much pain matters to the calf in that hours that follow the procedure? Not that acute, which is, as I said, very easy to treat with lidocaine, but what about the hours that follow? Okay, this is another type of procedure called the conditioned place avoidance procedure. This is, again, another pen built by Thomas. And in this case, the animals, and you're randomizing appropriately, both in terms of the color treatments, et cetera, but I'm going to walk you through one particular type of pairing. So in this case, there's a calf, and it comes in one day, and you put it in this disbudding pen, and you disbud it. As I said, you're using a lidocaine injection. We also actually use a sedative on our farm, so the animal is basically out of it during the procedure. But the animal wakes up, and it spends the next 6 hours in that pen. So it's sort of waking up, feeling the effects of this hot iron disbudding. And as it feels it, it's experiencing this distinctive environment, this blue triangle environment. Next day, you bring the calf back, and you do a sham procedure. So again, the animal falls asleep, has lidocaine, but it hasn't had hot iron disbudding. Wakes up, and it experiences the red, okay? Next day, you bring the calf back, and you put it in the middle pen, and you say, hey, calf, where do you want to go? So in this case, the calf's not experiencing the pain of the procedure. What you're asking the calf is, what do you think about the memory of the procedure? How do you remember these two distinctive environments? And the expectation is that one type of memory is going to be more aversive than another type of memory. This is what the results look like. So this is the time spent in the two pens. These are our box plots, and you can see almost no overlap between the box plots. The animals are choosing to avoid spending any time in the pen associated with disbudding. So they're not being disbudded when it happens, right? This is just, they're avoiding the memory of a location associated with disbudding. And moreover, they're avoiding the memory of the location associated with that post-operative pain period following disbudding. Here's another way of looking at the data. The animals would eventually choose to lie down in one of the pens or the other, and I think we had one calf lie down in the disbudding pen. Okay, I'm going to give you another example of how we can ask this kind of question. This is, again, using our calves trained with our red and white screens. But in this case, instead of doing a reversal task that I showed you earlier, we're going to do a what's called in these kinds of tests a stimulus generalization task. So the animals have learned, basically, in this case, red is go, white is don't go. And then we show them, basically, screens which are sure shades of pink. What do you think of a pink screen? So this is basically asking the calf, is the cup half empty or is it half full? Is it an optimistic or a pessimistic calf? Okay? And this is, okay, so people have been doing these kinds of studies since B.F. Skinner, right? So the 1920s, and this is what you get, whether you do it with a pigeon or a rat or a dairy calf, is you have what's called a stimulus generalization curve, okay? So a fancy way, if you show an intermediate color, they go an intermediate amount of time, right? So here I showed you earlier, our calves are really good at this. They never go to the negative. They always go to the positive. And the middle ones, they go to sort of in a middling kind of way, right? Importantly here, I want you to look at the error bars. So not all the calves agree. They all agree about the positive and the negative, but they don't agree about the intermediate. So some are showing this more, you can think of more of an optimistic bias, and some are showing more of a pessimistic bias, right? The calves driving this standard here think the glass is more of a half-empty kind of world, right? Yeah, it looks like a midway pink, but I'm going to treat it like it's a light pink, right? Okay, this is before disbudding. What about after disbudding? You get this downshift. So all the calves are more pessimistic. This is in the hours after. So this is the hours and days after disbudding. So again, it's a way of saying, well, does the pain in that period after disbudding matter to the calves? Well, it matters enough that it causes this cognitive bias. It makes the calf treat the world like it's more negative than it used to think of the world. Okay, one type of evidence. Another type of way of looking at this is using this test. This is an anhedonia test. It looks like it's being fed a milk bottle. It is one of our milk bottles. But in this case, we're feeding, like very commonly used in laboratory animal testing, just sugary water. So this is a treat. So it's basically just a sucrose solution. The calves, interestingly, respond to a treat differently than they respond to a meal, right? So, and that turns out to be really important for this test. So the calves, once they learn this, again, all of the calves always go drink the bottle all the time. They love their sucrose solution, right? It's I think like giving the calves a Coke. So it's probably bad for their health in lots of different ways, but in this case, it's really good for our studies. The calves love having their Coke. They go and they drink it. All is good, right? Then you disbud the calves. Oops, go back one. So here is the change in their sucrose consumption after disbudding, and what you can see is all the animals other than 3 actually are consuming less, and a large number of animals are consuming either nothing or hardly any of the sucrose solution afterwards. Now, these are cows that are still drinking their milk meals, right? So they're still eating. They're just no longer interested in treats. And that's the idea with anhedonia testing, is you're no longer doing those things that you used to enjoy. There's a lovely story in the human literature talking about an end-of-life patient, and this woman's describing that she no longer enjoys dancing. Used to that was bring a great pleasure and something that she no longer enjoys doing. In this case, the calves no longer seem to enjoy drinking their sucrose solution. You also see, though, in this case, and this is my final point, a great deal of variation among the calves. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because that's a last sort of idea to get you to think about. So this is our change in sucrose solution. I'm about to show you that data in a different way. In this case, I'm showing it in relation to pessimism score. So I showed you already in the cognitive bias task that calves vary. Some calves, before you do anything to them at all, some are more pessimistic and some are more optimistic. And the question is here, which are the calves do you think that respond most in the anhedonia test? The pessimistic calves or the optimistic calves? And this is a slide showing those results, which is that the strongly negative responses are really being driven by the animals which are already pessimistic before you do the disbudding. That's important, I think, as sort of general effects in terms of how we think about animal care, because essentially we've somehow or other set these animals up in terms of all of our other interactions we've had with the animals before to expect the glass to be half empty. And it sort of creates then this opportunity to start thinking about, well, what's the sort of narrative of the animal's life? What have we done? What might we have done differently to set up positive expectations for these animals, so that when they do experience bad things, and we all experience bad things, that they treat those things as something which is easier to cope with, rather than some animals which find it very difficult. Okay. So take-home messages here is that there's lots of these new, I believe, exciting and very interesting methods of assessing how, in this case, how much pain matters. But I think more generally, these kinds of tasks can be applied to a range of affective states. And also why they might matter more to some animals than others. And final point there is that the work on the affective states is really experiencing an explosion of scientific creativity. I think makes it a very exciting place to be doing work right now. So leave you with images instead of more text. As I said, we have this framework for thinking about animal welfare. We can use conceptions around natural living to try to better understand the kinds of things that might be important to animals. So for example, we use an understanding of what the cow does with the calf to help try to understand how we might improve our feeding practices. Very important to be also considering effects on health and functioning. For example, we look in all these examples, for example, on changes of weight gains, calf health, etc. Health and functioning also obviously played a big role in terms of understanding the positive effects associated with providing the animals outdoor access. Even relatively brief periods of outdoor access can have positive effects. And finally, I showed an example of the apparatuses that we can use to come up with interesting, novel scientific approaches for asking animals about what really matters to them. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Dr. Very for the excellent presentation. And now it's time for question. So the people who are in this room, you can just ask the question directly. We'll pass the speaker to you. For the people who are attending the seminar online, just send your question through the QA, and the Crystal will ask on behalf of you. Okay. So now to question.
Thank you for the presentation. I thought it interesting when you showed that slide that shows the expression of heat when the cows were outside versus when they were inside. And even though they were under the same THI, outside they show more than they were inside. Any hypothesis or rationale why would that be the case?
I mean, I think that there's lots of ways. Our indoor barns are designed well for lots of reasons, but in terms of the quality of footing, right? Often there's manure slurry, concrete is not. It doesn't give the ideal amount of traction if you want to try to mount another cow. And I think that when everything else is okay, the cows are still able to cope. They're still able to do things. But when it's sort of a cascade of effects, is my sort of pet theory, is that when things start going wrong, it's like, oh, okay, I'm already sort of clapped out from the heat. I don't want to take the chance of trying to mount that cow. But you go outside, and again, this is even just for a short period of time. All of a sudden, you're on foot on a different kind of surface. As I said, the animals are often going out in the evening, so they're sensing. Again, don't have edited this. I'm making up a story, but I think it's true. This is when they're most likely to see that temperature difference, is like early evening, right? Barn's still hot, but outside it's starting to cool off, and that you see that the heat events. Only there aren't that many happening anyways, right? They're relatively rare, but they're just much more frequent. Also, I should say, they're also much more focused in this case, right? I mean, I didn't show you that, but you have a whole barn versus you have, in this case, Anna Marika's area, that outdoor access area is actually relatively small relative to the footprint of the barn. Yeah.
Any more questions? Okay.
Oh, thank you, Dan. It was great presentation, my favorite type for the last couple of years, I would say. So it's really nice.
Thank you.
I'm just curious. I mean, I have a question for the disbudding, basically the pain perception and everything. So have you ever tested, I mean, if you give the calves, a treat before or after, would that make a difference? We take the kids to the dentist, you give them a treat after
Yeah.
So would that make any difference,
Yeah,
you think? I mean,
cool.
have you tested that or?
Cool. So in a way, if you think of that first study I showed with the injection, so that shows, and again, actually, in the last slide where I talked about what the animal's expectations are and how important that is, maybe in terms of creating opportunities for a good life. We all know about placebo effects, right? So drugs work not only because they work, but because we expect them to work. So our expectations are very important. Lots of beautiful work done on this. And we can see that to some extent with the calves in the first injection experience. So the animals know they're going to get a treat, right? And so even though they already know that because animals are experiencing those injections day after day, it's worth it to them. They understand that. So they sort of develop this set of expectations. And so yes, I think broadly in terms of what you're saying, are there ways that we can think about engineering the expectations of the animals that create much more positive life stories for the animals? Absolutely. I mean, we've done actually recently really, and it's fun work to do actually for students in the audience, doing work on training cows. And yeah, the cows, if the cows go in, for example, I've got this lovely set of videos I can show you later of calves, of just heifers being brought in for injection. Heifers normally, if you haven't worked with a heifer before and you try to put that heifer in a chute, anybody who's done that, this is an unpleasant experience, not just for the heifer, right? But if the heifer has this association as I go in the chute and I get a treat, the heifers will run through the barn and into the chute. And they'll run through the barn into the chute even if you're going to give them an injection. Right? Of course. So and so all of a sudden you take a nasty, unpleasant chore for the heifer and the farm staff and you turn to a pleasant chore. So like, yeah, why not do that? Now, it's different. Like some procedures we do, like disbudding, you know, I do think, like that's why I made that slide about the anhedonia. I do think that the worst effects on the animals of experiencing these procedures can be mitigated by having done the work in advance to create the idea that this is going to be, that life is more positive. But this is still going to be a bad day for the calf. And there's lots of other things we can do, of course, which I didn't talk about. I mean, there's good pain treatment protocols for disbudding because it doesn't last, the pain lasts, let's say, days in that case. There's other procedures which are much more difficult, actually castration, but I still think, so we're not going to live in a world where every calf has a good day any more than all of us have a good day. But we could live in a world where we set up the animals to have positive expectations. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have a question online.
Yeah, we've got a couple. The first one is from John Rossett. He said, thank you for the amazing presentation. The prairies can experience extreme winter temperatures. How do you think going outside in those very low temperatures affect THI and overall well-being?
Yeah, so I think this is, thank you very much for the question. And this is what I really wanted to show in that slide of those heifers outside. Not heifers, those were lactating cows. The animals don't spend as much time. It's not like the cows go out and choose to spend the night at 40 below. We build beautiful facilities, right? And they use them for the things for which they use those facilities for those things that they appreciate the most. And that can include absolutely protection from the elements. This is as old as farming. We create environments that protect animals from predators and climatic extremes, et cetera. So, and this is what I think is beautiful about our Canadian system. It puts us at an advantage of almost anywhere else in the world. We have phenomenal indoor systems, which absolutely I don't think we should be stepping away from. However, what the cows are showing you is even with those phenomenal indoor facilities, you open the barn, they're occasionally going outside, and you know what? They're doing things that they don't do inside. And the heat data just shows you that. Actually, in the middle of the winter, it's not like you're getting an advantage from heat detection because the heat detection is not so much of a problem as I showed you. But there might be other ways. The animals are showing these showing these sort of gross muscular kind of activities which are unusual inside the barn. And to me also, I think the animals, even though they're only there for a short period of time, seem to be enjoying it. So I think both can be true, that the animals don't use it very much, let's say in the winter. And of course, none of this takes away from the farmer's responsibility of keeping the animals safe, right? If there's a skating rink out there, you're not going to put your cows outside, right? So this is not advocating for sort of a brainless solution. It's rather giving farmers different options that they could use, that could work on their farm to allow their animals to do some of these behaviors. And I think the kinds of options we see are going to be as different as there are farms.
Okay, and one more. This one's from Case. Great presentation. Is the Canadian government going to demand that cows go on pasture?
Well, first of all, Canadian government will never do, this is my prediction, we're never going to see, at least in my life for sure, but probably in the life of everyone in this room, we're never going to see the Canadian government passing laws about what happens on Canadian livestock farms. In dairy and in other commodities, we have the individual commodity groups that take ownership over their own governance through the NFAC process. So for example, Dairy Farmers of Canada developed their own code of practice. This is led by dairy farmers for dairy farmers. And so it's a question that the dairy farmers decide for themselves about what are the things, what are the kind of, I guess the way I think about it is, what are the kind of farms they don't want to have in their industry? What do you want to be sure your neighbor isn't doing because you think it's going to make you look bad? So for example, the dairy farmers in our first code said, we're going to make sure that all the calves get lidocaine for disbudding. They said, basically, the dairy farmers said, I don't want to be in an industry where my neighbor is saving, I mean, it's only a few cents, but where my neighbor's saving 10 cents by not giving lidocaine to my calves from disbudding. I don't want that industry. I think they made the right decision on that. But I don't get to make the decision, and the Canadian government doesn't make the decision. The dairy farmers make that decision. I gave you another example how actually, this is, I think, a much harder one, but we're working together as an industry to make it work, is this moving towards group housing. So the dairy farmers decided that we want to have our calves kept in groups. What those groups look like, they might just be 2 calves, it's up to the farmer, but there's the industry made the commitment it's going to move in that direction. If I could wave a magic wand, but I've been trying to wave this magic wand for 30 years, it hasn't worked. I really think it would be smart for the dairy farmers to get together and say, what's one thing that could make our milk just look different than, for example, the milk from 20 miles to the south of here? Is if we said, no, in Canada, when conditions warrant, we've got these beautiful barn doors, but we're so confident in our barns that when the conditions warrant, we keep those barn doors open. We could do that. But we haven't done it up till now, and will the dairy farmers choose to do that? I don't have a sense of the future for that. But I mean, I hope so. I really think that's a kind of win-win for the cows, and it's a win for the industry. But I don't know. But yeah, I do know it'll never be the government. I shouldn't say never. Yeah. In our lifetime, I'd be willing to, I'll bet a case of beer to anyone who thinks the government's going to create a law about whether we keep cows on pasture or not.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Wayne. Okay.
Thank you, and a great presentation from my perspective as well. I'd be interested in hearing what you think about an animal's interest in change in its environment. I think there's a general thought that change is not good. And yet, and I'll use your barn door example, I've seen many situations where we've opened the gate from one pasture to another and animals are jumping and there's a freedom and an enjoyment in this change. And it's not because the old pasture had bad food, it's just a change. So I'd like to get your perspective on change and how much of what you're observing might be related to just a change in environment.
Very interesting question. Answered a couple different levels. One is that, as I hinted at a little bit with our individually housed animals, that I think sometimes we're rearing animals which make them highly sensitive to neophobia, very fearful of new things. And so that can play a role. So yeah, when you start changing things developmentally, you change a lot of things at the same time. The other thing is, and I think this is important about sort of thinking about choice-based systems, is if you have the barn door open, not every cow needs to go outside. And so we've done lots of studies like that. And sometimes there's like that old cranky cow in the back. It's like, no, I'm quite happy here. Thank you very much. She, of course, already has the best stall because she's the boss. And she's got life sussed, and she has no interest in sort of following these youngsters outside. And that's fine. But she's got the choice. Yeah, so I maybe that's a couple different ways of thinking about it. I do think there's a sort of a hubris. I can say this as an animal scientist. I think in animal science we have this idea that, no, we're going to, let's say, develop one diet, and it's going to be the perfect diet, and we're going to get it to 3 decimal points in terms of, sort of the nutritional requirements, and we're going to feed all animals that diet. And you know what? I mean, it's not that it's a bad option. It's great, as I showed. Our cows are coming in for that diet, right? But not every animal always wants that. And so we've done cafeteria kind of studies like that too. And so, yeah, and again, it's maybe at the margins. How important is it is a different question. But for some animals really do want do want a bit of variety. And are there ways of building that in? And that's the last thing I want to say on that is I do think that actually just creating, it takes some of the responsibility off our shoulders. If we give animals options, for example, in having those barn door open at night, it actually takes pressure off our barn. And for those animals that are important, they can do it. So we don't have to maybe in this case, invest in extra ventilation. Ventilation's good anyways, but, versus opening the barn door, well, maybe some cows are quite comfortable in here. But the cows that want to go outside can pick a different, in this case, a thermal climatic environment. Yeah.
Any more question? Okay. Mark.
Thank you, Dan. Great presentation. Dan, do you see any benefits that carry beyond when you do those choices for calves? Do you see any benefits that carry over for the lifetime of the cow? That translate into something that the farmer can actually observe later on?
Yeah. So, I can tell you stories. This is one of the problems, and I'll admit it in terms of our own research program, but I think in general with the way we do research now is that it's often, of course, we need to get the study completed before the funding ends, and we need to get the publications out and the students graduate, and we have sort of a scientific industrial complex which sort of churns things out, and the timeline for that is not the life of a cow. And so, in the studies we looked at, they showed you the experiments relatively short term. I have farmer stories. And so some of the things that farmers appreciate by calves that have been reared socially is that they find that these animals are able to, for example, we have the idea that we don't change systems, but in fact, especially with introductions of technology, we need to be training our animals, let's say, to use an automatic milking system. And so which animals, given the data I showed you, which animals do you think are going to be more likely to be easy to train to enter a new system like AMS? And so you have farmers that tell you these stories where they think they see differences in that long-term handleability of the animals. And also, but I'll say one other thing, which is going to sound unscientific, but I think it's also really important. And again, something which I've changed in terms of the way I think about and communicate in animal sciences, which I didn't used to. I guess when I started, I used to think that the only thing that was important to farmers, we talked to them about how much, what their profitability is going to be. What's the income over feed costs? One of the things farmers say to me all the time when the social housing is they love seeing the calves playing together. They love seeing the calves interacting. The joy they get when they go into the calf barn. And that, of course, if somebody wanted to maximize the return on the investment, they probably wouldn't be in dairying, right? That's the reality, is that those of us that work in agriculture do it because we love the agriculture somehow, and people work in animal farming often because they really enjoy being with the animals. And creating environments that allow the animals to have the people to have more positive interactions and see the animals having more positive interactions with each other, I think are also really important. But the things that we don't talk about, we don't think about, we don't quantify, is sort of outside of, I think, modern animal science. I think that's our mistake as animal scientists. Yeah.
So just a follow-up of that, in terms of a changing mindset.
Yeah.
When you're talking about management at the beginning of the presentation, you talk a lot about management. There's seems to be a disconnect there, right, between what managers think and what's going on in the farm. And remind me a lot of Edward's Deming when he's talking about the statistical process control in terms of don't blame the worker if the problem is the process, right? So do you see the mindset shifting people, okay, the animal's not the problem anymore, it's more the system and the process you have going on there?
Yeah, it's like this. So, it's something I came in talking about how it come from wildlife and then pigs, but the thing I love, lots of things I love about dairy, but one is that it's so complex. The grass through to the milk and the breeding and the feeding and all these different things, and then all these developmental aspects we talked about now. And so absolutely, to come in and think you're going to do, and this is definitely the way I thought when I started as a graduate student, so don't do this, graduate student. I thought I'd come in and do an experiment, and the next day I'd go and tell the farmer about the results, that the p-value is 0.04, and then industry practice would change. No. Of course, people are doing practice for lots of good reasons, also historic reasons and cultural reasons, and all these things all mixed up. And also, they're smart enough to know that one study is just one study. The next study might go the opposite direction, right? And so I do think, as talked about at the beginning, the importance of this long-term relationships of building something together. So really understanding what are the concerns of producers and working together with them to find this sort of menu of options, not one solution for every farmer, but different options that might work for different farms. And absolutely, yeah, you change the nature of the cow. Like, I've done this before. I've been the guy trying to push the heifer into the stall, into the chute. And he's like, oh, dumb heifer, she doesn't want to chute. It's like, no, it's not dumb heifer, right? But it's hard to turn the mirror back on yourself and think about all those different things. What's the heifer's experience? What have her previous experiences in that chute been like? How could I change this narrative if I started, 6 months before? Those are hard questions. And I think that is a big job for university researchers, because for the individual farmer, they're dealing with a million things. It's like, that it's a lot to ask them to just go in and sort of invent these processes de novo, but we can, as academics, absolutely take chances, do the crazy things, train heifers, and see if that really makes a difference in terms of sort of creating what you can think of as sort of virtuous circle. You do a little bit of good for the heifer at the beginning, and that heifer ends up doing good things for you, which then makes the management easier, but it also coming back to sort of getting rid of that sort of the 10% or 5% or 1% of farms we don't want in the industry. We don't want the farm in the industry that's beating on their cows, right? Why does that happen? It's because of this idea that the heifer won't do what I want her to do. And so we need to take a step back, breathe, think about all the pieces, and put those together in a way that let the cows have a good life, but also let the farmers have pleasant interactions with their animals. So it's not one thing. It's complicated. It's a lifetime of work, and it requires working together as a team.
Any more questions? It's an amazing presentation. I just have a simple question. I don't know much about dairy cattle, so I know a little bit about the swine. So you show the slide, the dairy cattle also like the sugar solution, right? So in the swine industry, we add the sweetness in the feed,
yes,
to stimulate feed intake,
yeah,
to help the weaning process.
Yeah.
So is the sweetness also used in the dairy industry to help the animal husbandry or not? Yeah.
I mean, there's lots. So one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about, but this transition, like for pigs,
yeah.
And so like the baby calf is a pre-ruminant, right? Yeah. So, but then how do we get her off milk onto solid feed? And so this weaning is hard, like it is for the pigs. Yeah. And so part of it, again, and that's where I learned some of the things that I did with early weaning for calves, come from the early weaning experience with pigs, is how do we motivate calves to start getting interested and start sampling? And, yeah, and absolutely, there's interest, of course, in changing aspects of formulation in terms of the diet. But there's also tricks in terms of presentation. How do you provide it? When do you provide it? These kinds of things. And it's very important because, as I said, partly for cross-sucking in this case, but in general, and actually especially the case when we're feeding these calves these higher milk rations early on, it actually becomes more difficult to create a smooth transition to weaning. So we need to get really good weaning practices, especially when we're feeding calves more milk. And it requires a lot of sort of these combination of innovations. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. So we may have one quick question before the lunch come on. If not, oh yeah, okay.
One more. I can be loud, don't worry. So just one more question. I mean, I'm curious. So for the cows that they had access to outside, the one that they went outside and the one that they remained, did you see any changes in the rumination time, in the total rumination time?
Cool.
In the pattern?
Thanks. So I'll just repeat the question just for Zoom, just in case they can't hear you. So yeah, what's the difference in terms of rumination behavior, but I'll also say feed intake maybe, to add to that, for cows that have outdoor access versus indoor access. In the experiment I showed you, at least I can't remember that data offhand, but I'll talk about an earlier experiment which maybe provided sort of in a sense, I think a good test of this, is that I don't want, the farm manager that we had when I first started work is a fantastic individual, a huge respect for. But one reason why is he would push me. And for sure he pushed me with the cows, but he also pushed me with this. Is like, he said, okay, Dan, you can put those cows outside, but if their milk goes down, it's coming out of your research budget. Right? So you probably live there, right? It's like I can do anything on the farm that makes those cows produce more milk. He never pays me a cent. But if I do anything where the milk goes down, it's like, no, it's coming out of my back pocket. So it's like, okay. So I was very careful with what I wanted to know, right? Because you'd think, I mean, we all know that. Like if we took all our animals and switched them over to intensive grazing, even in British Columbia in the spring when our grass is great, it's very hard to achieve the same level of production with just grass as it is with a well-formulated TMR. But I sort of gave you the hint already. Our animals go out there and they graze for sure. So you look at, they're doing that behavior. But their total intake in TMR, no difference. Total, their milk production, unchanged. So whatever, I think the cows are enjoying the grazing. I don't want to say they're getting nothing out of it nutritionally, but I think, and this is again a different way I thought about it and I think this is often in dairy, we think about by providing grazing, what we're doing is providing, access to cheap forage or something. We think about it mostly as a nutritional treatment. And the way I'm talking about it is like, no, the nutrition you're doing inside the barn. Outside, you want a nice place for the cows to be. And part of a nice place for a cow to be is they might have something to nibble on, but nutritionally, it's like I believe if you did a long enough, well-powered experiment, you could detect those effects. But it didn't cost me a penny, that trial. That's the thing I remember.
Okay, and you may have more questions, and during the lunch, pizza lunch together, you still can ask or discuss with Dr. Reddy during the lunch time. And he also have some time before he go back to BC, and you can also talk to Dr. Reddy if you have more questions. And please join me and thanks Dr. Reddy for the excellent presentation again. And also, we have a pizza lunch after the seminar. And they also thank you very much for coming today, right? And so thank you very much. Have a good day. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks again. Yeah.